The future determines the present. Now, we talked about the main historical battle we've always had in history, and it's still the same historical battle today, whether we realize it or we don't realize it, and it's always been Christ versus Caesar, because it's always been the sovereignty of God versus the sovereignty of man, or the sovereignty, actually, of the state. We talked about law as the integral part, and maybe not just integral part, but the most necessary part of our evangelism, because evangelism is not just snatching a soul from the fires of hell. Evangelism is about who wins in history, whose sovereignty is going to control the civilization. And we talked about the fact that Jesus Christ actually controls history. Imagine that, a novelty idea for our modern churches. That Jesus Christ, actually, his resurrection and his ascension wasn't an act of escape from history, was an act of enthronement, so that, as is mentioned in the Old Testament and many times repeated in the New Testament, he sits at the right hand of God to see what? To see all his enemies become his footstool. It's not coming back until this is done. Sit at my right hand until I make all your enemies your footstool, until everybody comes to kiss the chosen one, the Son. Now we got to talk, and I think the last thing we need to talk about today is what's our view of the future. I hope you caught the pun in the title, as the future determines the present. Normally we say that the present determines the future, right? What you do today determines what will happen in the future. That is wrong. The future determines what you do today. Quote, "Someday the worker must seize political power in order to build up the new organization of labor. He must overthrow the old politics which sustain the old institutions. If," it's very important here, "if he is not to lose heaven on earth, just like the old Christians who neglected and despised politics." I want to read it again. I want this to sink very deep. This is a very important central quote that explains the last 1 century and maybe a little bit over 1 century. "Someday the worker must seize political power in order to build up the new organization of labor. He must overthrow the old politics which sustain the old institutions. If he is not to lose heaven on earth, just like the old Christians who neglected and despised politics." This quote is from Karl Marx, from his address to the Hague Congress of the Socialist International in 1872. Our arch enemy in the last 2 centuries. I want to repeat one part of it. If he is not to lose heaven on earth, just like the old Christians who neglected and despised politics. Throughout his whole life, Karl Marx's experience with his fellow socialists must have been a thorough disappointment. Being considered the founder of a movement, the most eloquent and logical thinker of that movement, a kind of a biblical patriarch for so many socialist activists, he saw his movement go astray from the very strong logical system he had laid out. In the later years of his life, very few of them seemed to understand the main thrust of his theology or ideology. So many were focused on his economic and sociological writings and insights and exalted them as the greatest scholarly work ever written. But Marx himself did not believe his economic insights to be the culmination of his work. And you're talking to a guy, and right now you're listening from a guy who, in his 11th year of age, read Das Kapital. That's me. Okay? And I can tell you for sure, he didn't believe his economic writings to be his main and most important work. Das Kapital wasn't even finished within his lifetime. He must have not considered it important. In fact, if you go to book 4, you will see that he ends with the question of what is an economic class, which is the central concept that he was supposed to explain, because his whole ideology was based on the concept of economic class. He ended there. He lived for another 14 years and never finished it. Must have not considered it important. Engels had to finish the book. Far from considering himself mainly an economist, Marx actually spent most of his time arguing eschatology. He considered his view of history and the future way more important than his view of economics. While Das Kapital is undoubtedly his largest work written, the bulk of his writings during his lifetime was devoted not to teaching economics, but to preaching the heaven on earth as he understood it. He spent the bulk of his time in attempts to comment on current events and how they would lead to the inevitable communist revolution. The very beginning of Marx's career as a movement leader actually started with, anybody remembers the book? The Communist Manifesto, 1848, a book that has very little economics in itself, but it has a lot of historical interpretations that have an eschatological objective. The achievement of that heaven on earth that the Christians have lost, but the workers could achieve for themselves. Marx had a disdain for any speculative philosophy or scholarly work, by the way, including his own. In fact, he openly claimed that, the quote, "The purpose of philosophy is not to explain the world, but to change it." His whole philosophy was manipulative philosophy. It was not philosophy that looks at the world and try to explain it. It was a philosophy specifically designed to change it according to somebody's agenda. You think it's just the Fabian socialists in Britain that had that. In fact, the whole socialist movement from beginning to end is exactly that. All philosophy there is designed to actually promote and bring to fruition somebody's agenda. He was not a philosopher, he was not an economist, he was the prophet of a coming millennium that the workers could achieve with their own effort. Engels himself, his friend, also followed suit. Much of his writings and books were devoted to discussing history and philosophy in the light of the coming workers' revolution. The most important book of his, written when Engels was in the height of his intellectual powers, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, was an extensive study of the development of the institution of the family from the position of historical materialism. And guess what it ended with? It ended with the expectation for an inevitable social revolution by the economic class, which was not affected by the traditional family values, the proletariat, and therefore able to produce that new social system of communism. Both of them were first and foremost eschatologists, not economists and not sociologists. Murray Rothbard, you probably heard of Murray Rothbard, the Austrian economist who popularized von Mises and classical liberal school in the United States. And Murray Rothbard, who was amazingly informed about the different movements within Christianity, but kind of amusingly ignorant about their true nature and belief systems, in a 1990 article, an article of 1990, the title of the article is Karl Marx as a religious eschatologist. So I'm not the first one to notice that with Karl Marx. Declares Karl Marx to be the communist counterpart of post-millennial Christians. To a certain extent, I agree, actually. Rothbard actually was a little bit biased and ignorant about it. He also describes as post-millennial Thomas Müntzer and the Anabaptists in Germany, which they weren't. They weren't post-millennial. But at least he got that one right. Of course, Marx didn't learn from Müntzer. Müntzer wasn't a post-millennialist. But at least he got that one right, that Marx actually was an eschatologist, and he picked up his eschatology from the post-millennial Christians. And we'll see why. One thing Rothbard missed, though. The socialist movement didn't have only post-millennialists. It had its own premillennialists, and it had its own amillennialists as well. That's what many people don't realize, and Rothbard didn't understand. And the career of Marx and Engels within the socialist camp was a constant battle against the rival eschatologies in their camp, because they wanted to defend a comprehensive, optimistic communism that will take over the world. In fact, at that same Congress in 1872, there were the premillennialists, the anarchists of Bakunin. They rejected any political action, focusing only on individual action, terrorism, individual communes, and so on. They believed that those individual terrorist actions will somehow magically, supernaturally trigger spontaneous revolutions. In anarchism at the time, just like modern premillennialism, if you go to some of modern dispensationalist churches, was kind of a mixture of individual pietism and apocalyptic expectations of a coming collapse. So that was anarchism. That was their premillennialism. And they believed that will somehow bring their version of the second coming, which is the final world revolution, which will destroy the capitalist world. And in fact, the quote from Marx above was actually a reply to these premillennialists within the camp. There were amillennialists as well in the socialist movement. Those were the trade unionists. In fact, they were the most influential trade unionists at the time were British trade unionists. And trade unions are so powerful in Britain even today, right? Of what I know. Those were social theorists who understood the moral corruption of the individual workers and were doubtful about the ability of those workers to have a successful revolution and organize a socialist state. So most of them just looked at revolution in its spiritualized meaning, only as social reforms aimed at making life better for the workers through parliamentary means. No violent revolution, no second coming, because it could not produce anything of real value except suffering and death. The trade unionists said at the time we should focus just on making life better for the workers within the framework of the modern state. So by 1872, they called themselves realists, which means at the time meant pessimists compared to Marx. The trade unions in America, for example, never accepted Marxism from the beginning. In 1914, the trade unions in every European nation abandoned their international solidarity, supported their governments in the Great War. In fact, they were very inconsistent Marxists. And Marx and Engels fought just as ferociously against the petty bourgeoisie of the trade unionists as they fought against anarchism. The question now is, why did it matter for Marx and Engels? Why were they so adamantly defending their optimistic view of history against the premillennials and the amillennials in their camp? Why did Marx and Engels believe that this is the most important issue that deserves for them to actually stand against other Marxists, against their own followers, and ferociously argue with them? Why did they believe that they needed to do that? Why is that important? In order to explain this, I want to return you even farther back in history, about 1900 years back in history. And I'm going to tell you another story of history. I don't know if you all like history. If you don't, just let me know. In the time of Octavian Augustus, the heir to Julius Caesar, and that's an interesting story. So don't get asleep yet. Now, the distance of time doesn't always allow us to appreciate the significance of his reign and the reforms and the political regime he established. And I'm talking about Augustus. Only a few historians today realize the importance of it as a revival, a kind of enthusiastic revival of the classical civilization. Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, calls that time the Indian summer of the classical civilization. Do you have that expression here, the Indian summer? You know what that means? Kind of late summer, good enough for Indians to suddenly figure out the winter's coming, we need to do something about it. We call it gypsy summer in Bulgaria. After several generations of internecine strife, civil wars, economic and political crisis, Augustus embarked on a program to establish peace in the land and restore the grandeur of Rome as the mistress of the world. And he was serious about it. The immenseness and boldness of his political, economic, and cultural reform was staggering, actually, for a society that has always experienced change only by incremental steps. He was a revolutionary, even as an emperor. And yet, both the oligarchy and the people enthusiastically supported everything he did. Augustus was indeed Augustus, which means divine one for them. The son of the gods who came to establish his peace. To achieve his objectives, he actually used all kinds of propaganda, much better than what we have today, actually. He commissioned his friend, the poet Virgil, to write a poem that praised Rome as the fulfillment of all ancient prophecies about the world. And thus we have, and actually pointed to Augustus as their culmination of those prophecies. Okay? Virgil complied, and thus we have, anybody remembers the name of that poem? The Aeneid. The finest piece of ancient poetry, with the best artistic characteristics of ancient Greece, combined, of course, with the basest kind of sycophancy that history has known. To give credit where credit is due, actually the official propaganda of the Caesars was far superior as a piece of literature to the boring nonsense that comes out of both BBC and the American TV networks today. It was actually art, unlike today. And yet, when a modern man reads the documents of that era, both the official propaganda and the neutral accounts of it, one thing is quite surprising. There is no mention of one word. There's no mention of the future. If you read the Aeneid, if you read everything at the time, anybody who was a witness to all these reforms, enthusiastic about what Augustus was doing, there is no mention at all of the future. The optimism of the era of Augustus was actually not based on expectations of the future. In fact, the very point of the Aeneid was that history stops here with Augustus and his reign. History pointed to a specific time. When that time came, there was nothing beyond it. Far from promising bright future to his empire, Augustus promised only a return to the past, to the golden age of mythological heroes and their mythical heroic deeds. A summary of his promises would be, I promise to stop time and not allow anything to change. The past belongs to you and to your prosperity. That's what you will see if you read the Aeneid. There was no historical optimism, none whatsoever. In fact, psychologically, Augustus was promising Rome to build some kind of a defensive perimeter against the demons of change, the ghosts of the future. A perimeter so strong that Rome will remain in its blessed, static state of timelessness forever, protected against the uncertainty of change and future. Augustus himself presented himself as the embodiment of the old Greek heroes of that mythical golden age. There was no expectation of the future. For a modern person, it is just depressing when you read them. In fact, future seems to have meant danger and uncertainty, and for the Romans, change was the equivalent to hell. In the middle of this excitement, a little bit after Augustus, a man came along and wrote words that were never heard in the ancient world before. A promise that was absolutely unnatural to the soul of the classical man. For all things belong to you, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future. All things belong to you. It's impossible for us after 2 millennia of thorough Christian influence upon our thinking to appreciate fully the revolutionary meaning in Paul's words. It's just impossible. You got to completely abstract yourself from the modern world, from 2 centuries of Christendom, to understand what Paul's words meant for the people at the time. Nothing like this has ever been said nor thought about in the ancient world, except in a very limited nationalist sense in a small nation on the outskirts of the empire in Israel. And even there, the Hebrew prophets certainly didn't promise the world or life or death. They had the land promised to them, a piece of land that was promised to Abraham, because that's the way they interpreted it, this piece of land. Even more puzzling was the absence of the past. Remember this? And let me read it again. The world, or life, or death, or the present, or future. What is missing? The past. Apparently it wasn't a mere omission. For in another place, the same author said, forgetting the past. It wasn't a mere omission. It was very self-consciously forgetting the past. Nobody should forget the past. That was the battle cry of all religions and all state propaganda at the time. In fact, if you look at the official edicts of the Roman emperors against Christians, every time one phrase is very specific in all accusations, official imperial accusations against Christians, that they forget the customs of their ancestors. Every time it's the same thing over and over again, that they forget or they reject or they despise the customs of their ancestors. Don't forget the past. You can't forget the past. You're lost completely. The past, the ancestors, the golden age were the anchor of hope, the focus of all effort, of individual and corporate effort. Change was evil, demonic, future was dangerous. No one wanted to have it, to possess it. In the ancient world, there were only two promises available to people. And I mentioned them in the previous lecture. Out of history or back to the past. And here Paul promised his listeners, the future belongs to you. Not an escape from the world, not a return to a previous mythical state, but an optimist view which promised blessings in history, in the future. The whole New Testament was full with these promises. John's revelation, combined with Jesus' words, read in the context of 1st century AD, promised them victory over both the empire and over the Jewish temple within a generation after his death and resurrection. The Great Commission promised them victory over all rival religions, over whole nations. The Epistle to the Hebrews promised them the hopes and the vision of the Old Testament prophets realized on earth in history, while they were enjoying that one Sabbath rest promised in the law. Jesus promised them personal reimbursement for their sacrifices even in this life, together with resurrection and eternal life. Remember, if one forsakes houses and money and mothers and family and so on, will have 100 times in this life plus eternal life. Change not only wasn't a demonic threat anymore, it was a happy event. It was an act of God. It was eagerly to be anticipated, even if it meant trials and tribulations. Because on the other side of that change was God's victory over his enemies in history, and therefore the victory of the church over God's enemies in history. Christianity went out and proclaimed that history from now on belonged to Jesus Christ and his church, and that nothing could stop the church's victorious advance throughout the whole world. That's what the difference was between Christianity and the pagan religions. That was the main difference. Soon Christian thinkers were developing philosophies of history to match this victorious optimism. Even before Augustine presented to the ancient world the city of God, Eusebius and Athanasius declared, independently of each other, that nothing could stop the victorious march of the Church of Christ in conquering the nations for the kingdom of God. The old world was crumbling down before their eyes. The demons and their false prophets were silent and impotent. The empire fell exhausted and eventually surrendered. In fact, you've got to read Athanasius and his optimism. I mean, the first thing you will think is, this guy must be crazy. He writes like he sees victory everywhere, and he did. Augustine saw 6 ages in history, a world that was becoming a better place in the plan of God for redemption, that frees not only the soul from sin, but the society too. Isidore of Seville actually took the 6th age and gave it a name, Regnum Christi, the kingdom of Christ, and declared that it would end when the whole earth was under the dominion of King Jesus. The pagan world could offer nothing to compare. Nothing. Celts and Slavs to the north had a kind of cyclical view of history repeating itself over and over again. No promise, neither in history nor in eternity. The Germans believed in the final conflagration of the world in what they called the Ragnarok, which was the dawn of the gods, when all gods and all heroes will clash in the final battle, and everybody will kill everybody, and nothing will remain. Aren't you full of optimism now? Pagan Rome was paralyzed by superstitious beliefs, and in fact the main belief was in an ancient prophecy that the city will last for 12 centuries, as many as were the hills in Rome, which made many expect its fall in AD 447. That was the year that exactly 12 centuries will pass from 753 when it was officially established. The Western Empire actually fell in AD 476, so only by about 29 years, I guess. The mistake was by about 29 years. Pagan Egypt had long ago lost its statist religion. Its temples were empty and only a shadow of former glory. To use the Vaughan phrase, resistance was futile. Christianity triumphed. Why? The opposition had nothing to offer. No hope, no optimism, no future. Ironically, the only rivals that gave good resistance to the spread of Christianity were not pagans, but Christianity's theological cousins, Arianism and Islam. And both of them borrowed victorious expectations from Christianity. Arianism surrendered somewhat early. Islam lost its impetus after 2 centuries of conquest. And later on, Islam had no optimism because at the time of the First Crusade, who was on the advance? It was Europe. Now, a lot of people look at the First Crusade as if it was an aggression against the Muslim world, big Christian Europe against a small Muslim world. Let me tell you this. In territory, the Muslim world was 6 times larger than the Christian world. In population, about 15 times as large. In fact, at the times of the First Crusade, Christendom looked like a small principality on the outskirts of the Muslim world. And yet they attacked because they had optimism. This was a testimony that Christian Europe kept the optimistic vision of the future handed down from the first generations of Christians. The pagan world could not offer a consistent optimistic view of the future. And very soon Christianity was pouring out of the borders of Europe. By the 18th century, the planet was a Christian planet. And I'm serious, it was a Christian planet. True, the majority of the world's population still believed in their ancestral religions and superstitions. But Christianity was everywhere, and Christians controlled the world. In the 18th and the 19th century, a Christian missionary, even when hated, was nevertheless feared and respected, because everybody knew there's power behind him and in him, and power that the local shamans could not oppose, not to mention that there was hope coming with a Christian missionary that a shaman or a priest could not offer. In Christian Europe itself, the enemies of Christianity tried to raise challenges against the faith, but even those challenges at the beginning, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, were still focused on the past, on the supposed golden age of the classical antiquity. You know, we as Christians reject the term Middle Ages. We know the origin of the term Middle Ages. It means the Middle Dark Ages between 2 periods of enlightenment. But on the other hand, the very term, it is coined by the Renaissance scholar Leonardo Bruni, was a testimony against the Renaissance itself. It only showed that the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment could offer no vision for the future, only a return to the past, just like what we had in the Roman Empire. And that the hope of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment was exactly the same hope that Augustus offered to his subjects. We will stop history, we will return to the past, we will establish eternal stability, and there will be no insecurity, no change, no future. This is where the genius of Karl Marx was revealed. Marx was able to read history as no other man in his time. His economic writings are rubbish. His interpretations of current events were an example of intellectual confusion. But he was very talented to distill from history the most important truths and draw lessons like no one else could at the time. His ability to extract lessons from history and use them to promote his ideology was what made him able to create a movement that had such profound appeal. So Marx clearly saw the pattern. History is won by those who choose to remain in it and conquer it and have an optimistic view of the future. You win today by what you believe about the future. And your actions today are entirely determined by your expectations of the future. And it is not strange after all. Man really is entirely goaded in his present actions by his expectations of the future. We don't even think about the present when we decide to act. We actually only think about the future. You don't believe me? Let me give you a very simple example. Let's talk about buying a house in California. Let's say that you're offered to buy a very nice house, large house in a nice, quiet, affluent, upper middle class neighborhood. The house is clean, new, it's got a swimming pool, it's got a barbecue place, picnic place, 3 acres of land, and so on. Everything is in place, everything is clean. All you need to do is move in and live in it. Papers are okay. As soon as you can make the payment, the house is yours. I'll make it even nicer. Let's say the price is just fabulous, $50,000, which in California, in reality, $50,000 is about how much it's going to cost you to take a picture with the house. Take it or leave it. But let's say it's $50,000. Take it or leave it. If you don't take it, someone else will. So you better do it now. Everything looks nice and the price is stunningly low. Would you buy it? I would. It's pretty good. Because I know. I mean, it's really low price in California. All right. Let's imagine now that someone comes to you who is a reliable person and tells you that there is a problem with the house. The problem is not here and now. The problem is in the future. It is found out that the area around the house is found to be a landslide area, and the geologists expect the disaster to happen any moment. That happens in California, actually, in many places. It's an earthquake zone. No insurance company offers earthquake or landslide insurance for that area, and the current owner knows very well that in the case of landslide, he loses the house without any compensation. If you buy the house, you take the risk from him, and he goes away with $50,000. Indeed, much less than the true value of the house today, but much more than what he would get in case of a landslide. Besides, when we talk about true value, what does that mean? Let's say the market value at the moment. Would you buy the house then? I wouldn't, because I know that I'm losing $50,000. So the house is good now. The house is great. The neighborhood is great. The swimming pool is great. It's clean. You don't need anything. You don't need to do any renovation. Everything is perfect in the present. But only one hypothetical event in the future is enough to make you forget the present benefits and refuse the offer. Only one thing in the future is enough to make you forget about the house, because you don't want to waste $50,000 because there's only one hypothetical event in the future. So obviously, this thing makes you forget about the present benefits and only think about the future. I would say actually, even before you knew of the danger, you were still acting based on your expectations of the future, because really you were not thinking about what the house is now, but that you're going to enjoy it in the future, entirely from beginning to end. You were taking for granted that you would be able to enjoy the house, but in the future. And when you found out that you were not going to be able to enjoy the house in the future, this was the deal breaker. People like to say that the present determines the future, but the reality is different. It is the future that determines the present. It is our expectations of the future that tell us what to do today, how to act today, and where and how to invest our money, our efforts, and our hopes. There's even more. Our expectations of the future determine whether we will learn from history and from today and apply the lessons to the future. Because history in itself cannot teach us anything of value. Its teaching value depends on what you expect of the future. If you have a pessimistic view of the future, then anything bad or evil or any defeat that you suffer in history will be normative for you. You will not have any reason to learn from your defeats, because what are you learning from your defeats when inevitably you will get more and more defeats in the future, no matter what you learn. Whether you learn or not, you can't do anything to change history, because if you have any success, it will be only temporary. But if you expect your future to be a bright future, if you expect your future to be inevitably a good future, then your failures are not going to be normative. Your failures will be correctable, and you can learn from history. Marx knew this very well. Marx knew it very well that his people, in order to win history, had to have one thing, and everything else was not necessary, and that was to have the optimistic view of the future, the optimistic view of heaven on earth that the early Christians had and lost it. And that's why he was so insistent. What does that tell us today? It tells us today one thing, that in our evangelism, we need to focus on hope for the future. We often get involved, get entangled in arguments on apologetics, arguments on the place, on when the millennium is going to be, arguments on church history, and so on. But the one thing is very often missing. We're still pessimistic about the future in our evangelism. In our talks to our brothers and sisters, we're still pessimistic about the future. I was asked today about ebbs and flows. And that's why I was so reluctant to admit that there's ebbs and flows in history. I think there's constant growth in history, and that's my belief. And that's the only thing that will make our discipling the nation successful, if we are diehard optimists about the future, and we never allow a single pessimistic thought to cross our minds in everything we do. And that's a lesson that we need to learn and apply. Thank you.